if you would share with us, what was your experience of domestic violence shelters? Were they accessible? Were they safe?
They were not. They were not. And so my very first experience with a domestic violence shelter was after the police had come to my house. I was in a really abusive relationship, and they'd taken my partner to jail, and they brought me to the shelter. They had been to my house, several times, and and for all the different reasons that sometimes he wouldn't be arrested, sometimes they would ask him to just leave. And then other times it was very clear whether I had visible wounds, regardless of whatever I was saying. Then they brought me in, but because I was under the influence, then they didn't allow me to stay there. And at different points, there were times where I really did need that service. That wasn't even really a service that I wanted. He was going to jail. I knew that he would get out and he would come home. And after going to anytime that he went to jail, things would escalate. And that was, one of the scariest times for me. But I didn't have another plan. I didn't necessarily want to be there. But then later in life, there were times where I absolutely needed to be there. Absolutely. And there was a couple of times where they did let me in, but not for long. And even when I wasn't under the influence of substances, then they didn't understand trauma responses. I remember an advocate getting really close to my face and telling me that I needed to do my chores, and I just lost it. At the time I didn't understand, and I was thinking, oh, you're gonna get kicked out. It is 11 o'clock at night. You don't have any place to go. And remember, I remember trying to think, like, why are chores important when I can't even get out of bed? I didn't understand. And there were a lot of rules that I didn't know about, or maybe they had told me and I just could not figure it out. I mean, and then in looking back, that was, it's still an emotional response I have. Like if somebody gets too close to my face, I've had to explain it even to my daughter. I would say, I love you, honey, but you can't. It makes me feel a way that feels uncomfortable. She's 7, having to explain that. But I at the time, I didn't have the ability to explain emotional and physical responses to trauma. If you yell at me, if you flex any type of power or authority over me, I have a response that I don't even get to control. And sometimes that response is that would be, you completely freeze and you're not able to say or do anything. And then later you're like, oh, I should have said something, or, but you don't have that ability. But unfortunately it had gotten to a place with my partner I remember for years as the violence progressed, I didn't do anything. And, and it was my response that if I didn't say anything, if I didn't do anything, then he would stop, but that wasn't the case. And I remember the point where things changed and I started to fight back. And I started to say things, and that I think was because my trauma, at some point my brain learned it doesn't matter what you do, and that trauma response changed to be fight, and would say things back, and would try, even though he's way stronger than me, and it didn't really matter. Like it was still going to happen, but coming to understand, that is still the response. There were other times where I remember crying and begging to be there. And then that feeling of I can't even access the thing that's designed for me, and how low you feel, like how worthless you feel, that you don't fit into that box. And I couldn't even figure out what it was, whether I was on drugs or not, or whether I was having a trauma response or not. It was like a mystery, a puzzle that I couldn't figure out.
Yeah. And what a frightening experience, and what a huge experience of just the ultimate rejection.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't, even when I was there, I felt like I know that they would say and do things that made me feel bad about being me. Like not only did they not understand trauma, but they didn't understand addiction. And, and they were part of the, people being sexually assaulted because addiction was involved. And I was often blamed for that. And they would say things like that too. Like, if you hadn't been in that flop house, that wouldn't have happened. Like, what are you thinking? And this is like where we're supposed to be safety planning. Like, they're supposed to be like, the point of what, even why we're talking about it is a safety plan. But I just remember feeling so dumb. Yeah, okay, you're right. I shouldn't have been there, and feeling responsible for this thing. And it wasn't until later that people, I started to encounter other people that were like, no, you didn't deserve for that to happen to you. And that's where like these resentments started to build, that I was just like, this place should have been there to help me, and they didn't understand these things, and really, really upset about that.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so incredibly painful. And thank you for sharing this experience with us so that, hopefully all the providers watching this can really learn about the impact. What is the impact when our services aren't accessible and aren't safe, right? And to just be really aware of what our actions and the words that we say, how they can really impact people, right? Despite our intentions, despite our best intentions. And
Absolutely.
so, what happened when you weren't able to access those safe environments and that advocacy?
Yeah, it at varying points, I had, there's one story that really stands out in particular, but the times that I couldn't access services, then I ended up going back to my partner. I ended up going back to the house that we lived in at the time. I mean, later on, we ended up getting evicted for domestic violence, but through a loophole. And that was that it was part of our lease that said that if law enforcement comes to the property, then you can be evicted, even if they're coming to the property for domestic violence. And so that was the last house that we lived in. And then I ended up being homeless for a long time. But there were times that, that I had come, that I was brought to the shelter by local law enforcement, or that I had come on my own. And then there was a time specifically that I had just gotten out of the hospital and had pretty significant wounds from a really violent encounter with my partner at the time. And they had, it was like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I got to the door. I don't remember if the emergency room had paid for a cab. I'm not sure how I got there, but they said no. And then I was banking on being there, and I thought, this is a time that this really fits the situation. Like, I have no place to go as a result, and I have been wounded. And when I left, I ended up going to a place that I had bought and sold drugs at the time, and was sexually assaulted. And that specific like story stood out, when I was starting to do some of the healing work. And that's what was coming up with the person that I was working with. When I thought about these programs, then I blamed them for that. And I know that is not true today, but I still had a lot of resentment. And there were other times, where those trauma responses would come up. Like, I had maybe a few days in recovery and had gone through the detox, and then I would have a trauma response, and then I would be kicked out like late at night, not any time that you can really call anybody, and then would end up back, in these environments where drugs and violence are, that's part of the environment, and, would end up using drugs again.
Mhm. Yeah. We know that the substance use and the trauma is so intertwined, and the danger, right? It's all intertwined.